Welcome to the new Africa. This is the Africa we want. At ADS, we work to build this Africa and have operations in key sectors. Project financing, access to renewables and water, industrial development, technologies and media, distribution and franchises, infrastructures and real estate, automobile and logistics, in sport infrastructure and training facilities combining solar power and connectivity. Welcome to the new Africa. This is the Africa.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Building a Sustainable Future, partnerships to finance African infrastructure and the energy transition, with our moderator, Amos Hochstein, U.S. Special Presidential Coordinator for the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, PGII. And our panelists, His Excellency, João Lourenço, President of the Republic of Angola, His Excellency, Ayman bin Abderrahman, Prime Minister of the People's Democratic Republic of Algeria, Portia Derby, Group Chief Executive Officer of Transnet, Bill Killeen, Chief Executive Officer and Chairman of Acro Corporation, Mark Widmar, Chief Executive Officer of First Solar, James Mwangi, Group Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer of Equity Group Holdings, Julie Monaco, Global Head of the Public Sector Group, Banking, Capital Markets, and Advisory of Citi.
Good morning. It's great to be with everyone this morning on this panel. I'm honored to be able to moderate such a distinguished panel on partnerships to finance African infrastructure and energy transition, which is clearly among the most important issues that we face today, is how to mobilize these partnerships in finance. And there's no more appropriate place to have this conversation than here at this summit at the US-Africa Business Forum, as it's critical that we bring together US and African government leaders together with the private sector and finance to see how we can tackle these important challenges. According to the African Development Bank, the African continent will require around $170 billion a year in infrastructure investment. But we have to be honest and we have to be direct, because we're nowhere near meeting that goal. According to also to the African Development Bank, we're around $100 billion short of that annual investment need to invest in infrastructure. And therefore, we need to work together to do much more, even though we've made some progress. We need to work together to mobilize more public and private finance, encouraging global investors to direct their efforts towards Africa at the scale and in the sectors that require it most. And we especially need to do so as the world embarks upon an energy transition that is clearly going to be the biggest infrastructure investment that the world has seen since the Industrial Revolution. So on this panel, we're going to be able to tackle these challenges by hearing from government leaders, from private sector folks who have done investments, and from the finance sector that needs to tell us what do we need to do together, all of us, to make sure that we can reach these kind of a goal that was stated by the AFDB of $170 billion of investment a year. So let me start with President Lourenço of Angola. At the launch of the PGII in June at the G7, the G7 announced a partnership. President Biden announced a partnership between an American project developer, Sun Africa, to develop a $2 billion solar project, which is already an expansion of a previous project. And we also know that the DFC, the US DFC, invested in the past $100 million in AfriCell. Both projects are not one-offs, but things that can go and be expanded and have second and third phases. So, Mr. President, can you speak to how this project and others under development will help Angola meet your ambitious climate commitments?
Bom, nós começamos a transição.
Well, we began the energy transition for a while now, doing partially the sources of production of polluting sources of power, the thermal power plants, and we invested in the production in the hydroelectric power plants. The country has, at this time, the dams of Lauca, the Kambambi Dam. We also have been building, and we expect to conclude in 3 years, the Great Dam of Cambasa. And this dam itself will produce 2.1 gigawatts of power. At this time, so in 3 years, our country will be producing close to 9 gigawatts of electric power. Therefore, at this very time, the production of power in Angola is less and less from polluting thermal power plants or gas power plants. It's more and more produced by hydroelectric power plants. We are building, and it's already half concluded, the distribution network of power using the basin of the Kwanza River to take power to every corner of our country. This power has already covered the north of the country, the center of the country, and the provinces of Luamba and Bié, and we're working to try to get financing to carry this power into the southern region of the country to cover Huila, Namibia, and Webi, and also for the eastern part of the country to cover the provinces of Laguna North, Laguna Sul, Muxico, and Quanicubano. In parallel, we are betting on beginning to produce solar power, so with photovoltaic parks, 2 of which are already producing power, the national electric grid. So we have already inaugurated this year one in both projects in the Bay of Benguela. They were built by a consortium that also includes Sun Africa, a U.S. company. These 2 projects are already being used in offering power to industry and the population of our country. If that weren't enough, because we are trying to reach a percentage of 80% of clean energy within 3 years, between around 26, 27, we continue with projects to promote solar power, one of which is the largest that the country will ever know. Also done in partnership with Sun Africa, a U.S. company, and it will be built in the southern region of Angola to benefit 4 provinces, Namibe, Huila, Cunene, and Quando-Cubano. So this is a project that will be carried out by Sun Africa. He has the financing, the Exim Bank of the U.S. of $2 billion. Just to say that at least in this area of producing clean energy, Angola is benefiting from the financing and the knowledge of U.S. companies in this realm.
As we think about Angola as an oil and gas country that is now expanding and doing these kinds of projects for financing for the energy transition, I want to turn to another country doing similar things in Algeria. And Prime Minister Ben Abdulrahman, Algeria's recently taken some major steps to attract more private investment, including in diversifying, as I said, the energy sector. And this summer you introduced a new investment law, clarifying regulations, and actually creating incentives in some sectors as other reforms that you've taken as well. You've issued new solar tenders in addition to that or through that process. Can you talk about the private sector response to the reform efforts and to incentivizing the sector, and what are your plans, and how do you intend to attract additional investment in infrastructure specifically, and of course the energy transition?
شكرا. I would like to thank you all to have chosen this topic at this high-level forum. This is very accurate. In order to diversify the economy, we have to look for sources of funding. Therefore, Algeria has reconsidered the regulations about investment in Algeria in order to give people confidence to the investors. For the first time in the history of Algeria, we have passed a law to all the aspects of applicability that pertain to investment. This is the first time that we have done that in Algeria. So this is the only way for investment in Algeria, and we have started a digital platform in order to avoid the traditional ways of investment. So this will incentivize the investors more broadly in various areas which are all open now for investment. They also give them guarantees to transfer their profits because the legal framework is very stable now. It was one of the handicaps before, so we realized that this was the pitfall, and we had a profound study, and after that we tried to benefit from all kinds of studies and researches that had been done before, and we started to look at all these approaches. And our president, Mr. Abdel Majid Tebboune, looked into that. So this is the economic aspect. So our law has been activated because we are trying to diversify our economy and financing because we would like to do that in all branches of our economy in a continuous way. And so, and I'm telling you that we have all kinds of guarantees that you find in other countries. We have them now. So we hope that we will have a win-win situation whereby investment will be beneficial for all parties. We have 46 million consumers, and we are close to Africa, to Europe, to the Arab world, and we have an outlook which is systematic. We look at our neighborhood in Africa, and we even and we also try to help the landlocked African countries. We use a railway, and we use renewable energy, and we would like to benefit from all the experiences that would be profitable for us and for all the other people involved. Thank you.
As you're doing all of that, you're also supporting Europe at a time of crisis where Algeria has been a critical supporter to get Europe through the winter, for this coming winter and last winter. So we note that. And you talked about rail and infrastructure that you're attracting as well. And I want to turn to the private sector, because as we know, the governments want to attract investment, that we know, but what does it take? And so with us, Bill, you're the CEO of ACRO, decades of experience of building bridge infrastructure on the continent, and you actually support American jobs while doing it. So that's an example of how this benefits both of us. But I'd love for you to speak for a minute about your recent investments in Angola and other places, and the impacts that connective infrastructure can have on larger economies. If I can also then just push you a little bit, if you can also give us, as someone who's done these investments as an American company, what are the lessons learned from your perspective for others listening to you thinking about investing in Africa that you can share?
Sure. Thanks, Amos. I really appreciate that, and I appreciate being here on this panel. And I just want to say it's quite an honor being here with the Prime Minister and the President, so thank you so much. I think first I'll just talk about connectivity. When I look out there, I actually think of other infrastructure and it needing to be constructed. By that I mean power systems, because I'm hearing a lot of people talk about that we have to expand the power grid on the continent, or substations or water systems, whatever. And what we have found is that the roads and the bridges, especially in the rural and the secondary districts, are woefully inadequate. And what this does is it drives up the cost of these projects. It drives them up in such a way that maybe the ROI doesn't work any longer, or the financing becomes out of reach or whatever. But we need to address how to make the roadways and the bridges more robust so that they can, contractors feel comfortable taking on these projects. Another thing I think about is that really 60% of the population of Africa still live in the rural areas. And we need to reach out to them and engage them if we're to truly have a, should I say, expanding economy. So by that I'm thinking you put the bridges out there and it's sort of like build it and they will come, a saying from an old movie here. And by that I'm believing that the people will then start their own businesses, start their own farms, because now they can get to the markets because the bridges are in place. The fun thing that I was thinking about on the connectivity is specifically the free trade agreement. It has this yoke around it because of all of the blockages, the physical blockages in the roadways that exist. So we have to do something about that. And it's quite a big problem, because I know we've calculated that sub-Saharan Africa alone needs about 190,000 bridges, which sounds like a lot, but if you compare it to the United States, it's really not. The United States has about 130,000 bridges it needs today. So, and that's just on the existing roads. I keep thinking about you still need more roads if you're to have better distribution channels into the future, because you could look again, you look at the US, we're 7 times the number of roads that Africa has, and China's about 10 times. You need those roads for distribution reasons. And then you talked about partnering. And on the partnering side, what we try to do, we have partners in the countries that we work in, and we try to ensure that we're working with very reliable, honest, high integrity individuals that are well respected within the communities there. And we do have them working within the constraints of the FCPA. But most recently, ACRO, across its entire group, had the group certified to the new ISO 37001 for anti-corruption and ethics. And what that means is we're now requiring even of our partners in country to have their TRACE certification put in place. And then the other partner, of course, is the US Diplomatic Services. We would not have had the successes that we have had on the continent if it was not for how they've stepped up to the plate and hit the home runs for us. They are, without a doubt, the superstars here. I'm trying to think, the final thing that we were talking about was financing. So on the financing front, there's really only, from my perspective, only about 5 or 7 commercial banks that will do the structured trade financing. So what we do is we mature our projects, then we reach out to the commercial banks, We see which ones are interested. Once we have that in order, we'll reach out to the ECAs. It's typically an Exim. It could be UKEF, it could be SACE, but most often for us it's been Exim Bank. And we'll drive that project to its finalization. But if there's one hint that I would give, Amos, it's perseverance and it's patience. If you're going to put together a structured trade finance package, as we've done now quite a few times, it takes years, so you just have to be patient and persevere. Keep putting one foot in front of the other until you get to the finish line. And that's it. I'll leave it to you.
Thank you, thank you. And Portia, let me turn to you as the Group CEO of Transnet. And staying within the same theme of the critical infrastructure that is necessary, your company, Transnet, is a leading player in ports and rail and pipelines in South Africa. And as we're working to work on the energy transition, I see the energy transition as much broader than just focusing on solar or wind projects. It's about how do you capture and grow the value chain. So if we're going to talk about mining of critical minerals all the way to the port, we have to have roads and rail, and then we have to have the port itself to be able to have connectivity to the global markets, and obviously pipelines for all the right reasons. So, how do you think about the role of transportation for, in the infrastructure side, in the renewable energy transition, in the African space, of where do we go from here? How do we you have so much experience in this, how do you expand, and what's the role of, again, the same on how do you finance additional projects and make sure that you mitigate the risks for additional investment?
Thanks, Amos, and thank you very much for inviting us to be on the panel. I think the points that you raised are, for me, quite profound about the continent. It's just not, it's the bridges, it's the quality of the roads as well. And a fact that we often forget to go back to is when you look at our infrastructure in Africa, we've got 2.9 million kilometers of road, only 27% is tarred. We've got about 65,000 in total kilometers of rail throughout the continent, and 33% is in one country. And so when you look at the extent of the limitations that we face on infrastructure, road, rail, you have to obviously understand why we're at 19% of inter-regional trade. Because unfortunately, the routes and the roads that we have were designed at the time for colonial trade. So it was to exit it out of Africa and not to use it internally. So the point that you raise about bridges internally and roads internally, for me, are priority that we have to deal with on the continent. Now, if you look at, we were looking, and one of the things that we were looking at here in the US as Transnet is we've got quite a lot of infrastructure projects that we're doing. So we're looking at your Alameda corridor, which is a 32-kilometer rail line from Los Angeles, evacuating cargo out. That wouldn't have happened if the federal government hadn't stepped up and given the entity the $400 million loan, which enabled the project or catalyzed it, or at least fast-tracked the project. Now, we have a problem on the continent. If you look at the percentage of tax revenue to GDP, on average throughout the continent, it's 16%. The OECD average is 33.5%. So if a government is going to be able to fund infrastructure, how is it going to do that? The best performing country on the continent, at least on the data that I've seen, is Tunisia, which is at 32.5. My country is just north of 25%. So that brings me to the point around, if you're going to fund infrastructure on the continent, we have to get to a point where when we approach funding organizations, and in this case, I'll talk just to the US, we approach, and funding must be made available for infrastructure either to the government, to the state-owned sector, or to the private sector. It has to be on concessional terms. Now, our obligation is to make sure that we pay the money, and the concessions, to our mind, are the duration of the debt. It has to at least approximate the life of the asset, first of all. And increasingly, I'm pleased to see that a lot of us on the continent are starting to argue for our own currency debt, not dollar-denominated debt, because that takes us out of another problem, which is the currency risk that we are constantly facing. For me, to get towards the close, if you look at the renewable sector, which is, to our mind, the new industrialization age, The highest value quality manganese is in Africa, low sulfur iron ore, Africa, cobalt, lithium, virtually every single thing that is required for this new green revolution. It has to be that the processing and most of the value addition happens on the continent if we are going to be able to have stability going forward. So to my mind, I think it has to be a much more mature partnership that happens between ourselves as well as the US, the private sector in the US. And remember, on the continent, we still have a massive job of actually building a sustainable private sector beyond the small that we have at present. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Portia. And that's a good segue in a minute, then putting our finance folks on notice that that's what we're going to be talking about is how do we bridge that gap of getting the finance from the private sector in order to be able to overcome the risks that, as you said, it's not just country risk, it's and currency and commodity risk and reputational risk and so much other. And we've been spending time, and we'll talk about that in a minute, about how do we bridge that gap, because you're right, here we're passing legislation in the United States, we have to incentivize and create financing and loans, and how do we do that in a more effective way? I also want to note what you said about creating the value add so that Africa is not just a raw material supplier. It can be in some cases, but there are ways to add value. It doesn't mean that we have to go and build battery factories in every country, but there could be processing of different kinds, smelting, and in some countries that's there. But if we can have more financing for the value add, we'll probably have more financing for the connective infrastructure in between. And that's what we need to figure out. But Mark, let me turn to you as someone who's already done some of these kinds of projects in multiple countries. And as everybody's trying to de-risk, as I just said, you seem to have figured out how to do that. And First Solar has worked already in South Africa, Namibia, Zambia, and Burkina Faso. You've made these decisions. You've figured out how to go in. Can you share with us what is the policy or regulatory environments that have allowed you to come in, and how has that worked out for First Solar, and how do we learn from that to scale it?
Yeah, well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today and be part of the panel, and it's great to be part of a conversation with Africa's aspiration for long-term energy independence and security, and ultimately to help the world achieve its climate goals. So it's a great conversation and it's a great convention. So thank you for having me here today. We started off on a journey a number of years ago to evaluate every market from a perspective of solar resource. The great thing about renewables and solar is there's opportunity for liberation. To the extent there's a good resource, there's an opportunity to create independence. Your ability to harvest photons and make electrons is enabled now, that disruptive capability that wasn't really available for most of us a decade plus ago. Africa, I think we all would agree, is probably one of the best places in the world in terms of a sustainable resource of solar, sunlight, in terms of capabilities of the most sustainable opportunity maybe any of us could envision on the world today. When we looked at Africa and some of the projects that we've done over the years, our strategy has been somewhat around syndication of risk. We've had partnerships with multilateral financing organizations like World Bank, IFC. We leveraged the Scaling Solar program. We partnered with developers, in some case European developers and others who had better insights on the markets. We partnered with local engineering, procurement, and construction companies because of their knowledge and understanding of the marketplace. So that's what's enabled our near-term success. What we'd really would like to see, though, is a longer-term strategic opportunity for us and for others, given the opportunity that Africa presents, not only from a long-term industrialization that will happen, growth from an energy load perspective that will evolve, and an opportunity to harvest one of its most strategic resources, the sunlight. But there's, as we think through that, so check the box first off on opportunity in terms of solar resources, one of the best in the world. What we need to evolve to, though, is a more consistent policy environment. We need certainty. That's one of the challenges that we've had right now, and some of the opportunities that you referenced have gone extremely well, and in some other cases, we've had some misses.
Can you give an example of a couple of that consistency that you need in policy?
Yeah, I'll start from some of the programs that were initially put in place in South Africa, and we had committed to, and we started development of some projects in South Africa, and then there were some policy changes that were implemented at a point in time that effectively walked back from the contractual offtake agreements that were put in place. And that's what becomes devastating and ultimately could present a challenge of whether the market's investable or not. These are long-term investments, to do projects that are hundreds, if not gigawatts of capacity. To develop them, especially in some more developing nations, it can take time. And you need the commitment that once those investments are being made, that the offtake agreements will be there in place. And so modifying contractual terms and agreements can be very challenging, and I think it can undermine the investment appetite that you'll need in order to continue to grow. So that's one thing. Policy environment, I think, has to be there, and we've got to evolve to a point where it's more conducive and constructive. We also would love to find ways to continue to localize the supply chain. We have a vertically integrated manufacturing process, and when we establish a manufacturing footprint, we look to localize the supply chain. And so there's another enabler of what we can do to enable our long-term success and create that strategic partnership within a region. I think it's very, very important to have that strategic alignment and that type of partnership. So yes, there's been some successes. I would say we've managed it through syndication of risk. One of the greatest opportunities, I think, to move forward, though, is to have better policy certainty and envisioning long-term strategy and objectives and aligning policies to achieve that.
Thank you, Mark. And James, let me turn to you as we're now talking about the people with the money to finance these projects. And you're with Equity Group, and you've had a lot of success really investing across the continent over the last several years, including in places that other investors saw as too risky. You've also been able to do something a little bit different, where you've been able to serve and invest in the part of society and populations that others have not, including specifically with women entrepreneurs and women-led small and medium-sized businesses. So if you can share a couple of things. One is, what are the key attributes you look for in determining a project is bankable or commercial for you to invest in? And the second is, same as I asked before, give us some advice that you would give to other financiers, other finance corporations that are looking to make investments and to enter markets that until this point they've seen as deemed them as risky, and that where you haven't. What do you say to those folks?
Thank you very much. It is true that we have adopted an inclusive finance model, a low-cost, high-volume model to bring affordability, and as a result, we have been able to reach 18 million customers. But broadly, what we really look at the very high level, at the household level, at the individual level, is whether we are furthering that household's ability to become more sustainable. Because the more sustainable they become as a household, the more stable, then financing becomes easier. And sustainability, to a great extent, is how you are furthering that household's ability to scale their wealth creation mechanisms and diversification in risk management. That is very, very central. The second aspect is whether they are linked to supply chains and value chains, because standalone household enterprises and businesses normally get a lot of shock. But if you are able to organize within value chain and ecosystem, it becomes easier, because then it becomes a revolving fund within the ecosystem. But then the real test is to the businesses. And to the businesses is whether they are contributing to socioeconomic transformation of the continent. How is their ranking in terms of trust with the host communities? Because that, again, is the long-term sustainability of a business. How well are they doing in terms of environmental considerations or sustainability broadly? Those are big considerations. However, we have prioritized a couple of sectors, value addition, whether it is in natural resources, agriculture, minerals. That is a huge priority area. The second priority area that we have prioritized and make easy is productivity gains in agriculture. Are we seeing transformation in agriculture? And wherever a project heads to productivity gains, we really focus on it. The third major area is micro, small, and medium enterprises. We know those are the faces of the African people. And we're saying if we really have to be inclusive, we can't leave behind micro, small, and medium enterprises. We must make them a center of our leading model. And of course, the fifth one is the adoption of technology. The only way to leapfrog businesses and future-proof them is to encourage them to adopt technologies that make them competitive, because they are open to global markets. Now, you said about those intending to do finance in Africa. I think I would like to say money is not enough, or we need to look at deliberately at the borrowers and ask ourselves, what more? And for us, what more has been de-risking and capacity building. To a great extent, most of our finance is combined either with financial and entrepreneurship training, making the borrower better in repaying their debt and in managing finance and managing their businesses. And to the households, there is a lot of capacitation to do what they do better. We shouldn't assume that finance is a natural instinct capability. It's a process of learning. We all went to school to learn the various professions. We should regard business also as a profession and try to enhance and capacitate. So I would really like to recommend that we consider capacitating, de-risking, and empowering. And lastly is the issue of blended finance. A one-fit-all kind of finance may not really work in most of the communities, the high-risk environments. You need to partner with others, take long-term mix with short-term, look at credit guarantees, look at risk-sharing guarantees, and such components. Thank you.
Thank you, James. And I think that you're leading me right into where I want to go. Julie, Citibank, I have a couple of tough questions for you, but you're the right person to answer them. So last year, Citibank made a major announcement, a whopping $1 trillion in commitment for global sustainable finance. And one of the challenges of doing this, so if we're going to talk about micro, this is the opposite of, this is as far as you can get from micro, is $1 trillion commitment for investment. So one of the challenges that we face around the world is as we look at money being, the money spent, not the money committed, almost all of it is going to the OECD countries. And a declining percentage of it is going into truly low and middle income countries. So what I wanted to ask you is, first, how is that commitment going 1 year in? Yeah. Not putting you on the spot too much here, but how is that commitment going of spending and both volume and location? Right. But then I want to pick up on what, I would like you to pick up on what James just ended with, and he talked about the need for blended finance. And as we want to tackle $170 billion a year in investment in infrastructure, what do we need to do so that when the G7 and the United States included makes these commitments and others make these commitments, how do we get to partner Citibank with us and other institutions to make those investments real?
Okay, great. Well, first of all, thank you. It's a pleasure to be on this panel today. At Citi, we share the enthusiasm that we're feeling in this room for the opportunities and the growth in Africa. And to answer your first question of how do you make sure this $1 trillion, and I'll get to the specifics of the $1 trillion commitment in a minute, how do you make sure that doesn't all wind up in the OECD? From a city perspective, by nature of who we are, it's not going to wind up in the OECD. If anybody reads our balance sheet, reads our annual report, you see how much business we do outside the U.S. We're on the ground as a local bank in 100 countries, and so this $1 trillion commitment is truly a global commitment, not an OECD commitment. So that's the first thing. Second, as it relates to Africa, we have the experience and the know-how of being a local bank on the ground in 18 countries, doing business in 40 countries. We bank 1,000 local corporations, over 1,000 government entities, as well as local financial institutions who we partner with. And we cover we're not just dealing with the large, we do cover the micro with our inclusive finance team working with local development banks on the ground in Africa to help solve some of those micro problems as well. And we also bank over 2,000 multinationals that are trying to do business there. As it relates to the $1 trillion commitment, we couldn't have been prouder that was the first announcement that Jane Fraser made when she became the CEO of Citi. And I think it's a really strong commitment to sustainability overall. And let me explain how it's broken out. $500 billion of that is going towards environment, right? So this is all about net zero and climate change, and that's the $500 billion. The other $500 billion is what we're calling social finance, and that's going to cover everything from education to affordable housing to basic infrastructure, healthcare, and food security. And those are areas that we are key priorities, obviously, for Africa and a lot of markets around the world. Now, in terms of how we're achieving those goals, or how you asked me how far along are we? We're 18 months into that announcement. It's been about $222 billion that has been counted towards the sustainable finance. But let me also explain. We're talking about how much capital we're going to deploy towards sustainable finance. Some of it's financing and loans. Some of it is how much we're working together to structure transactions in terms of blended finance with development banks and multilateral development organizations and local development organizations. And a chunk of it is the capital markets and how we get access to the capital markets. So when we look at it, we say, all right, how do we do more we look at our clients on the ground in Africa and all the ones I just talked about and say, how do we make sure, and we've got a team here today, their job is to make sure that the Citi clients in Africa get their fair share of that $1 trillion of deployed capital. So what are we doing? Well, first of all, we're making sure that they have the framework, that they've adopted the sustainability finance frameworks. So I have an advisory team for public sector, which is what I'm responsible for. There's another advisory team for corporates that help them put the framework in and have the knowledge on how they're going to attract sustainable financing. It has to be tagged a certain way. It has to meet certain criteria. The other area is us really looking at we see it as our responsibility out in the industry to develop the tools that are going to allow that capital to flow in. And I'm just going to give you a few examples. One area is around sustainable linked bonds, right? Financing. We did our first deal last year for sustainable linked financing on the continent with Airtel. And it was $150 million, which helped the company support its operations and its investments across Gabon, Congo, Kenya, and Nigeria. So while also providing interest savings for the company and it's also going to achieve, because of the sustainability-linked bond, it's going to achieve social impact milestones, which is digital inclusion, gender diversity, because it was focusing on women-run businesses in rural areas. So getting our clients to understand how to structure transaction and how to be able to tell that story to investors so that you can attract that sustainable finance is a big part of what Citi has had to put in motion and gear around the world once Jane made that announcement and said, going forward, we're going to count everything that way. We don't necessarily count it by country. So I can't give you a specific answer because we may be financing someone in the Middle East who's asking for sustainable financing, who's then deploying that into another country. So it's a little hard, to sort of say it that way. The other thing is just around energy and infrastructure. So last year we advised on the port development in Senegal, Egypt, and this was an important milestone in accelerating Africa's roads to become a global trading powerhouse and improving the economic prospects. And we also helped coordinate $75 million transaction for Greenlight Planet, which helped them expand access to off-grid solar in Kenya as part of their larger effort to reach 10 million households in low-income off-grid communities. And we even in the past have worked with EcoBridge in the past with Exim Bank financing for Zambia. So it runs the gamut. Now, your last question that you asked me, which was blended finance. We know that everything we're doing today, and we're proud of everything we're doing today, is still not enough. And we're here today, and we're here over the next couple of days to say, how do we do more? How do we become more aspirational? At Citi, what we've spent a lot of time on is focusing on blended finance. And I have a team here that is a specialty. This is something that they've been working on for a long time. There's actually an entire chapter in the book that was released at COP by the Egyptian government on blended finance and how do we scale blended finance with recommendations. It's going to require that all the stakeholders in that capital stack change the way they behave. And we have the announcements around the reform of the MDBs. And what we really have to get to in blended finance to scale it to a bigger level is to understand the risk appetite for the different players and get those aligned in a way that unlocks more capital. We do have transactions separate from this, what I've already talked about, where we have seen that the NGO community is willing to come in and bring grant money into structures in order to make it bankable. We are starting to see the ability, especially in the environment space, where we can use carbon credits to make it financeable. But it really is going to be, how do we get everyone to align in the capital stack, take the risk that they're in the best position to take, and how to scale it. And that's sort of the holy grail that we're all working towards.
Thank you, Julie. And as we bring this to a close, I think what we know is that we have to have government reform and policy consistency, businesses that are willing to take the risk and from the appetite, and financing institutions that are willing to work and working in the reforming of the MDBs so that we can increase the leverage between the kind of risk that the MDBs and governments are taking to incentivize and to encourage you to take, in the finance community, to take additional risk and spend more money faster in a more efficient way. Let me thank again the panel, Mr. President, Mr. Prime Minister, and the private sector. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Amos. Your points were wonderful.
Yes.
Okay.
Throughout our company's rich 136 years